Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Counterinformation has a piece entitled 19 Years Ago Today, Journalist Gary Webb was murdered after exposing CIA drug trafficking. On December 10th, 2004, the body of journalist Gary Webb, then 49, was discovered in his home near Sacramento, California, after a moving company worker found a note posted to his front door that read, "Please do not enter. Call 911 and ask for an ambulance." Webb's death was listed as a suicide, but he was found with 2 bullet holes in his head, indicating he had been executed. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
What are some of your takeaways? We're now 19 years out from the what most people believe to be the assassination of Gary Webb, his incredible journalism and research on CIA drug trafficking and guns and bringing cocaine into the country. What are your takeaways almost 20 years later?
Well, first of all, we can bless the late Gary Webb for bequeathing to us a series of well-documented articles in the San Jose Mercury News, a well-documented book, Dark Alliance, which details quite scrupulously the rather ignominious story about how the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency either turned a blind eye towards their allies dealing drugs, particularly in Southern California, or were complicit with regard to their allies dealing drugs. Now, to step back for a moment, this is taking place in the midst of the Cold War, where the Sandinistas in Nicaragua had surged to power circa 1979, overthrowing the U.S.-sponsored dictatorship of Somoza, and the Reagan administration in particular, in power from 1980 to 1988, wanted to overthrow the Sandinistas and descended to all manner of foul deeds in order to do so, including mining the harbors of Nicaragua so that trade would be disrupted, if not stymied altogether. And, of course, they also helped to fund and subsidize the so-called Contras, the counter-revolutionaries, that is to say, who were accused credibly, not only by Mr. Webb, but by others, of dealing drugs. Now, if you go to the C-SPAN website, you may be able to dig up a rather startling display of then CIA Director John Deutsch, who had been summoned to an audience in South Los Angeles to try to explain this scenario that I've just outlined. He did a very poor job of doing so, and as a result, eventually lost his job. But I should also say that dealing drugs is not necessarily peculiar to the U.S. administration. I'm sure you and your audience are familiar with the so-called Opium Wars of the 1840s, where the British Empire forced opium on China, which obviously helped to destabilize the Chinese population. And opium addiction was not wiped out until the triumph of the Communist Party, October 1st, 1949. And we also know that with regard to the United States itself, that in order to destabilize the Italian Communist Party post-1945, which had won merits and plaudits for helping to overthrow Mussolini's fascist dictatorship, the United States turned a blind eye, or alternatively was complicit with regard to the rise of organized crime, the so-called Cosa Nostra, Lucky Luciano and all of his henchmen, as they began to deal drugs in Harlem, in New York, in particular in black communities across the country. And so we see that Black communities have been a kind of collateral damage with regard to these anti-communist Cold War hegemonic schemes. But we should also mention that this kind of genocidal policy is also inflicted in the region itself. We know that at the same time the United States was trying to destabilize the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, they were also waging a hot and cold war against neighboring El Salvador, up to and including sponsoring death squads. You may recall the notorious episode from the Reagan years when U.S. nuns were basically butchered by U.S. allies without any reasonable punishment inflicted upon them. And we also know that with regard to the neighboring country that is Guatemala, the United States was sponsoring a military regime that, in the first instance, overthrew the progressive leader Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. And by the way, the Argentinian revolutionary Che Guevara was passing through Guatemala City at that particular moment, and that left a deep impression upon him, which then was manifested with the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, January 1. But we also know that this military regime in Guatemala inflicted genocide against the indigenous population. So these are just some of the ignominious tales of U.S. imperialism, ignominious tales that if there were any justice, Washington would be dragged before the International Criminal Court, the World Court, the International Court of Justice, both simultaneously. And we would at least hope that if such an indictment were ever to ensue, that minimally the leaders of the State Department would have to consult lawyers before jetting all around the world for fear of being detained quite reasonably.
There's a new book called The Lumumba.
Hang on 1 second, because I want to one more point on this, and that is quickly speak to the irony how the United States Reagan administration gets involved in this to overthrow the Sandinistas, and now Daniel Ortega is once again is now the president of Nicaragua. He was a leader in the Sandinistas. So we went through all of this process to get the Sandinistas out, and now their former leader is once again a president of the country. We go to Afghanistan, and we've got to fight the Taliban, and we fight the Taliban, and we spend all this money fighting the Taliban, and who's running Afghanistan today? The Taliban, and not to mention the drug connection with the opium coming out of coming out of Afghanistan, and many say that Karzai, one of Karzai's brothers, was a drug lord, and that's one of the reasons why the price of heroin went down. But just that the irony that demonstrates how much money and time we've wasted.
Well, Mr. Ortega is still in the crosshairs. And as you know, his spouse is the vice president, number 2 leader in that country. And so relations between Managua and Washington are still rather strained. I should also say that with regard to Afghanistan, not only was there once again drug dealing, and there has been a fair amount of scholarship on this, I should add. You might be familiar with the book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, because once again, during the war in Vietnam, I'm sure you recall, if only from movies, about how dead bodies were shipped back across the Pacific with drugs in the caskets that then were sold. And once again, Black communities were the primary victim of this kind of deviltry.
There's a new book called The Lumumba Plot, The Secret History of the CIA in a Cold War Assassination. It talks about, alleges CIA involvement in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, this has long been known. As a matter of fact, it's so notorious that the CIA station chief in the Congo, circa 1961, when Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese patriot, was assassinated, Larry Devlin, he wrote a book. He was detailing his role in helping to make sure that Mr. Lumumba would meet his maker. you might also be familiar with the rather tragic and fortunate scene when a casket came back from Brussels, Belgium being the former colonial power. This is in recent years, to the Congo, bearing the remains of Mr. Lumumba, and the remains basically consisted of a tooth that somehow was not dissolved in a vat of acid that these barbarians, led by Devlin, inflicted upon Mr. Lumumba. Now, once again, the Cold War backdrop is key. That is to say that beginning in the 1880s, King Leopold of Belgium had basically, with the assistance of the U.S. and the British Empire and the French Empire, had swallowed the Congo, larger in territory than a good deal of Western Europe, as his own personal preserve. A bitter struggle ensued, leading to independence in 1960. But with the Cold War as the backdrop, there was this fear, hyperbolic fear, unreasonable fear, unwarranted fear, that Congo was going, quote, communist, unquote. But actually, this is part of a larger scheme, because during that time, as you gentlemen, I'm sure, recall, whenever there was any unrest anywhere in the world, the hand of Moscow was seen as the culprit. And what that rationalization served to do was to preserve the status quo, to preserve either colonialism and or neocolonialism. When Patrice Lumumba objected, once again, he was slain. And fast forward, Congo is still in the news, not only because it produces 70% of the world's cobalt, which is essential to the green economy, but also coltan and those smartphones that are so ubiquitous in North America as we speak. And then the latest news is that the war criminals in Israel are seeking to emulate their comrades in London. The comrades in London, led by Rishi Sunak, have talked about deporting migrants without papers to Rwanda. Well, the war criminals in Israel have gone one better, in the sense that they're talking about deporting Gazans to where else? The Congo. This cannot stand. This will not stand. Inevitably, it will become part of the bill of indictment at the International Court of Justice, with the South African papers being filed most recently. And I should also say, with regard to the Israeli connection, that, surprise, surprise, one of the major forces in the Congolese economy is the Israeli billionaire, Dan Gertman, who, if there was any justice, instead of being a billionaire, he too would be in the dock somehow, being made to pay for all of his crimes and misdeeds. And this, what has befallen the Congo, is not necessarily peculiar or unique to this African country. We see that in neighboring Cameroon, 91-year-old Paul Biya is slated for another election run. He is a satrap, a puppet of U.S. imperialism, which is why you don't read anything about him in your newspapers. Likewise, we see that, fortunately, the Bongos were deposed in neighboring Gabon, but alas, a military man has come to power that sees fit to continue their piratical deeds and misdeeds. So we obviously need to press on all fronts to change this U.S. policy towards Africa, and particularly towards the Congo, because unless we do so, I'm afraid to say that there will be 1, 2, 3, many more Congos in our future.
And a final point, when you look at the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the tactics of assassination, and we see, you know, what's going on now, whether it be in Lebanon, whether it be in Iraq, assassination is the tool of empire.
Oh, undoubtedly. And once again, Israel is equivalent to Murder Incorporated. I mean, there have been books written about hundreds, perhaps thousands of assassinations that the Israeli authorities have perpetrated since 1947, 1948, up to and including the most recent one in Beirut. And once again, if we do not mobilize, there will be many, many more to come, I'm afraid to say.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.